Assalamualaikum and welcome to the report. I'm Yasmin Khatun. As usual, I'll be taking a look at news stories from around the globe. As election fever hits Europe, we'll be taking a look at right-wing groups and anti-Islamic sentiment. Both Seleka rebels reorganizing in the Central African Republic and Russia holding back war crimes in Syria from the ICC. Here's your global news roundup.
European elections began this week for the 28 member states of the European Union. In a four-day continent-wide election, candidates have been contesting for 751 seats in the European Parliament. In the United Kingdom, the UK Independence Party has caused furore in the political scene with their push for representation in the EU Parliament. The anti-EU and anti-immigration policies have allowed them to gain support in Britain. Many have seen them as a softer face of the far right, while members have been accused of racism. The election results will be published late on Sunday night, once voting has finished in all EU member states. Russia and China have vetoed a United Nations resolution this week. The resolution was to refer crimes against humanity in Syria to the International Criminal Court. The proposal was made by France earlier this month. Russian Ambassador Vitaly Churkin said in his speech that a political settlement is needed instead.
Russia will continue to exert every effort to stop the bloodshed as soon as possible. We call on our Western colleagues to abandon their futile dead-end policy of endlessly escalating the Syrian crisis. We invite everyone who truly values the interests of the Syrian people to join us in the efforts aimed at a Syrian political settlement.
This is the fourth time that Russia, a close ally of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and China have blocked a UN Security Council action on Syria. The increasing disagreement within the Security Council has prompted Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson to warn of the effects to the reputation of the Council.
If members of the Council continue to be unable to agree on a measure that could provide some accountability for the ongoing crimes, the credibility of this body and of the entire organization will continue to suffer.
Seleka rebel group in Central African Republic says it has reorganized itself to exercise greater control over its fighters. The group has put in place a new chain of command to rein in its fighters in the north. Seleka coordinator Abdullah Husseini said, "Do you really want us to let loose all the Seleka fighters without any sort of organization which will watch over them? If so, fine them. If not, that is the only way to keep them under control." The government has condemned the move, saying the group has seized state property in this campaign. They have also accused them of creating a parallel army. The mostly Muslim rebels have been involved in heavy fighting with the Christian anti-Balaka militia. The conflict has displaced nearly 1 million people in the country. The African Union, France and the European Union have about 7,000 troops battling to end the conflict, which have so far failed. In what has been internationally recognized as a military coup, Thailand's army have taken control of the country's government this week.
To reform the social structure economically, socially and in other ways. To create equality for everybody and for every side. The Peace-Maintaining Committee, which consisted of Army, Army Forces, Navy and Air Forces, as well as the National Police, has to take control of power to administrate the country from the 22nd of May 2014, from the time of 1630 onwards.
Martial law was declared immediately with a nationwide curfew put in place. Opposition leaders and former government officials were summoned to the military headquarters. The takeover drew swift international condemnation, with the United States saying it was reviewing its military aid and other dealings. Afzal Ahmed, The Report, Islam Channel.
Now with me in the studio to discuss some of these stories is Dr Gavin Bailey from the University of Leicester and Dr Salman Butt, Chief Editor of online site Islam21C. Right, thank you both for joining us here in the studio today. European election fever hitting the UK also. Geert Wilders hasn't done so well. How do you think this will affect some of these right-wing movements across Europe?
It's very interesting. I think that Wilders sort of coming forth when people were talking only a few days ago about coming first is really interesting. Incidentally, there's one of the tweets I received as I came here suggesting that UKIP's vote is actually down on what it was last time. I'm not sure whether that's true or not. I don't know whether it will have much of an effect across Europe. I don't think that people in different countries will look at that and decide how they vote. But what's really interesting is the kind of assumption that Europe is currently having a wave of right-wing populism or far-right support that's increasing everywhere isn't really supported by the fact that it's true in some places, it's not true in others. So it's, you know, we can't look at it as though it's the same everywhere in Europe.
Salman, can I bring you in here? Now, Wilders has been propped up as a sort of leader for this right-wing movement, and he's had a lot of anti-Islamic sentiment in the past, a number of different things that have taken place. Will this loss affect the movement?
Well, it's too early to tell at the moment, but we can hope that it does. I mean, he is quite an inflammatory character, and his performance at the polls could be indicative of, him losing support and that kind of sentiment losing momentum, and we'd certainly hope so.
Gavin, why do these fringe parties tend to do so well in European elections?
I think the main reason is, particularly in the UK case, is that people actually don't care as much about the European elections because it's not seen as that important. Similarly for the local elections. And what tends to happen is that turnout is much lower than it would be in the general election. As a great example from a place where I did a lot of work on when the BNP were very successful, was that Stoke-on-Trent had a lot of BNP councils at one point, but one of the places where they won some of the seats was a place where the BNP vote didn't actually go up. It stayed exactly the same, but it was the vote for everybody else that went down low enough to be underneath it. And so it was because people just didn't bother to go out and vote anymore.
Now, with these European elections, there have been a number of different sort of right-wing groups under so many different names. Why do you think they're so popular? Why do they come about in these sort of fragmented forms? Salman?
Well, they say that the rise of far-right groups, it tends to be cyclical. So when you have a decrease in economic stability or the economies are getting weaker, then these types of groups tend to take over, and then when the economies are on the growth, then they tend to fade out. So.
And when they fade out, they tend to split because they're arguing amongst themselves. Even across Europe, with all of those different far right groupings, the possibility of them getting together in a far right grouping in the European Parliament is. The problem with that is that they don't agree with each other anyway, so that they'll be infighting and then deciding who can be a member of their group and who can't.
Okay, so for instance, we've got UKIP here in Britain, who are a right-wing group, who have come out. The Tories have said they won't be collaborating with them anytime in the future, although some right-wing members of the Tory cabinet have said, actually this might be an idea. How should mainstream parties be dealing with parties like this?
I don't know. I think one of the things that hasn't really worked is by going on very negative campaigning and just saying, don't vote for these people because they're racist, or don't vote for them because they're Islamophobic, because it doesn't seem to work. It just looks like the old, the three main parties are ganging up on them, and people will then have a bit of sympathy for UKIP.
Salman?
Yeah, I agree completely, because the way UKIP have been gaining support is they've been basically targeting people disenfranchised from, with the main ruling parties, the main three parties and the media, and acting like they're victims, acting like they're champions for the underdog, even though, as one radio presenter pointed out, Nigel Farage is the only person who's been on Question Time more than David Dimbleby. So they're given this platform to air their views. But during this, whilst they're doing so, they're complaining about how they don't have a platform, how they're speaking out for the underdog, how they're oppressed by the main parties.
So how should the Muslim community be reacting to parties like UKIP?
Well, the Muslim community should have a multi-pronged approach. At the essence of it, we should still carry on, giving da'wah, telling people about Islam, actually giving a positive image for ourselves, because that's where we've been lacking, arguably, for the last, or since 9/11, because there's so much negative press coverage, there's so much hysteria, and we have to actually push out a message of actually what's happening on the ground, what the Muslim community is up to. Because when that happens, you find that the average Briton, he or she, sees the Muslims at the forefront of charity sector. They see the Muslims at the forefront of, so many different aspects of society, and that will help to, counteract some of the negative media bias against the Muslims.
In some ways, though, I think perhaps even phrases like the Muslim community then become problematic, because it sets up, and this is very much a mainstream analysis, it sets up that there's a set of people who are separate, and there's a set of people who are separate on the other side. And people are diverse. Every what gets called a community is internally diverse, and it's those kinds of complications that are never really represented in how we talk about these issues.
Before we move on, I've got an article in the Huffington Post here which is saying Nigel Farage has captured the mood, a bit like Nick Clegg did in 2010. Right?
Yeah, well, he sees himself as the underdog, and that's what his party sees him as well. Trying to burst through the glass ceiling, rather than to try and get into the
the mood is an interesting thing, because again, is it all the same kind of thing? But some people will be voting UKIP because they're against Europe. Some people will be voting UKIP as a protest against the mainstream parties. Some people will be concerned about immigration. Some people will be concerned about multiculturalism in general. And all of these things get thrown into a big hodgepodge of mess that, somehow they tap into.
Okay, well, we'll come back to this. We've got a clip now with safety concerns for the Tatar community in Crimea. Many have been fleeing to Ukraine. Afzal Ahmed has been following this story.
The right-leaning Nationalist Svoboda Party have a heavy influence in the current interim Ukrainian government. After the Ukrainian revolution at the start of this year, a third of the Ukrainian cabinet have consisted of its members, in part to the increasingly nationalist sentiment of the nation. These include Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, Oleksandr Sich, who is the party's chief ideologist. The minority Muslim Crimean Tatars have been fleeing to western Ukraine to escape what they call Russian repression. In the western Ukrainian city of Lviv this week, the Tatar refugee community have been commemorating the 70th anniversary of the mass Crimean deportations by the former Soviet Union. Vigils were held to remember the 200,000 Tatars that were deported in 1944 by Joseph Stalin, where many died as a result from starvation and disease. With the presidential elections approaching this Sunday, many in the city are hoping that the new leader will be capable of reversing Russia's annexation of their homeland.
Right now, we're waiting for the elections. We will follow and listen to the decisions made by the heads of the government. I hope that things will begin to settle down and Crimea will return to Ukraine.
With the increasing bout of Ukrainian nationalism slowly building in the country, some have commented whether Tatars are safe in their adopted homeland. Afzal Ahmed, The Report, Islam Channel.
Right, before we go on to Twitter, I want to quickly ask you, Gavin, on this. The New Republic have got an article up where they're saying Moscow's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently condemned the European Union for rising racist tendencies among its member states. The article disagrees.
I think I disagree too. I think that in some ways, Europe is a very good place to live. Obviously, racism still exists. Nobody would ever say that it was something that was eradicated, but things have improved particularly in the UK over the last 30 years. And it's interesting that Russia would then turn around and tell us, sort of taking the heat off their own problems.
Okay, well, we'll come back to this and a few other things, but before we continue, let's have a look at some of your tweets.
Trending globally this week, tweeters have been engulfed by European election fever. @Riv Kotzlow warned people about the far-right nationalist threat, with I Am Stephen Jones surprised at the range of these groups on the ballot paper. The hijacking and merciless trolling of UKIP hashtag Why I'm Voting UKIP also got tweeters into a frenzy. Britain's first brief visit to the East London Mosque on Monday caught tweeters' attention. @TellMama UK tweeted for calm amongst Tower Hamlets residents and not to react to the provocation. @East London Mosque termed the stunt an invasion fail. The region of Xinjiang once again grabbed the spotlight after an attack that killed 31 people in the regional capital of Urumqi. @Information Day put the question of why China's Far West is in turmoil, hinting that these attacks may be part of a wider issue.
Right, so we saw a few different things there, bringing in Britain first. There's a tweet here from AJ Basir who says the mainstream political parties have ploughed and fertilised the field from which far-right groups have emerged.
I agree with that to a fairly large extent. It's very interesting that the narratives of sort of separation, the fact that Muslims in the UK are with separate lives and parallel communities and all that, which is a narrative which has been going on since the riots of 2001 up north. And it's that is part of the mainstream narrative about how Britain works.
Salman? Your thoughts?
I mean, to be honest, as a Muslim, you know, I feel that we have to be a bit fair and just, you know, when it comes to analysing Britain First and these types of movements, because I think personally, from what I've seen, the vast majority of the people involved in it will be absolutely ignorant and just, you know, being led here and there by.
This tweeter, he's saying it's the mainstream political parties that have set the grounds for these parties to emerge. Would you agree?
I agree from many angles, because one of the reasons, or one of their raison d'être, is to stamp out or to challenge so-called Islamic extremism, and this has been a big topic of concern for the mainstream parties, because this is the reason that we were sold the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. These are the scapegoats. These are the patsies almost that the general British public had to be. Or it was attempted that they were forced upon the public, so that we approve of these interventions.
And in many ways, that focus on Islamist extremists tends to have within it an explanation, which is that. It is things like segregated communities and cultural difference which causes those things to happen. And so even though I researched Al-Majroon a few years ago for my PhD, and we're looking at, in a city of 250,000 people, we were looking at 4 guys, and that was it. But that came to be seen as representative of all of the people who lived in that city.
Saying that, this is a year on now from the Woolwich attacks, and recently when David Cameron made his speech about the Brotherhood movement, he thought it was well-versed to mention these attacks by these supposed radicals when speaking about a movement which is very separate to these individuals. When our Prime Minister does things like this, is it irresponsible?
Absolutely.
I think so. I mean, it runs the risk of making the problem look a lot bigger than it is. And I think this is true on both sides, that by talking of particular places where, say, the BNP has a vote, and, OK, so a few hundred people may have voted BNP, but it doesn't mean that that particular area is a no-go area where every single person who lives there is a white racist. It becomes exaggerated, and connections are made between places and groups which Maybe they're in a very loose sense, but they're not absolute connections because, you know, people may move from one group to another, but that doesn't mean that the two groups are the same thing.
Okay, I want to come to Britain first now. Now, they've been to a number of different masjids up and down the country, in Scotland, in Bradford and in London. Should we be taking them seriously, Salman?
Well, it's hard to take them seriously, I admit, because, you know, going inside a mosque and handing out leaflets being paraded as an invasion is something extremely funny. However, it is something we need to have concern for because, you know, this sentiment against symbols of Islam in public is indicative of an underlying kind of deep hatred of the other, and in this case, it happens to be the Muslims.
Very briefly, Gavin.
I think it should be taken seriously because it's potentially something that will cause more trouble and more tension, and in a way it's another. In the same way that the EDL and Al-Muhajirun sort of appear and sort of drive each other on in what has been called cumulative extremism. We have another case exactly here. They're using the same kinds of tactics, standing around on street corners, in Brick Lane, waving alcohol around in order to draw out the, what was it, the Islamic Patrol. And
the two people.
Exactly, so we have a few people here and a few people there, yet the vast majority of people just go about their daily business without really taking any interest in that.
Thank you both very, very much. I do want to thank both of my guests, Dr. Gavin Bailey and Dr. Salman Butt, for joining us in the studio. But speaking of Britain First and their visits earlier this week, I paid a visit to one of those masjids, speaking to the team at the East London Mosque in London. They said that the attempt to invade their masjid was a complete fail.
Glasgow, Bradford and now London. Britain First, the far-right group, which launched in May 2011, have been mustering together what they're calling invasions of masjids. Armed with Bibles and grooming pamphlets, Britain First members have gone into masjids without abiding by any etiquette, demanding to speak to the imams. Police in Bradford and Scotland had launched an investigation before the group attempted their visit to London's East London Mosque. A masjid that's often filled to the brim, the group made their way at a quiet time of the day. We went along to the East London Masjid to find out what happened.
They came into the mosque and basically they were asking to see the imam. They were told the imam isn't available to meet with them. So they left copies of the Bible and some pamphlets on Muslim grooming published by them for the imam. What was actually quite disrespectful about the whole incident was the manner in which they came into the mosque. They came in with their shoes on, they trampled on the carpets which our congregation uses to pray. And it was just it's really sad to see that happen.
Speaking to Salman, the media officer there, I asked as to how it might have made their worshippers feel and what sort of an impact it might have on the masjid and its open door policy.
We've upped the security. We've increased the security now. So there's 24-hour security. Before we would have security from 9 p.m. onwards. Now we have security even in the mornings, and also we've had to close off some of the entrances and exits to our buildings.
After a weekend up north, this was another attempt to intimidate and frighten the Muslim community here in Britain. The East London Mosque regularly hosts thousands of worshippers, and it says a lot about these invasions and the confidence of this group in that they'd make their attempt pamphlets ready when the masjid is most empty. Yasmin Khatun, The Report, Islam Channel.